Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start soon. We're waiting for the arrival of the panel. All rise. Good morning, everyone. Before we start, I'd like to urge everyone to remain standing because this morning we are a nation in grief. We would like to take this moment to remember the very brave cabin crew and the passengers of flight MH370. We especially would like to remember the families and friends. And there's one person we would like to mention. Bersih 2.0 would like to mention Tan Ah Meng, who was a dedicated supporter and donor to Bersih 2.0 activities in our work. Can we please observe a minute of silence? The presence of the new chairperson, Maria Chin Abdullah, and the co-chair, or the deputy chair, Dato Farouk, and her team. The steering committee is also here. Now, no Bersih event is complete without our former co-chairs, namely, of course, Ambika Srinivasan and Pak Samad. Welcome to the People's Tribunal. Before we start, I'd like to just briefly tell you all about the program for today. We will soon hear from the chair, who will share the report with us, after which there will be a formal presentation of the report to the steering committee, followed by, we'll start with the report, followed by a Q&A, and then there'll be a formal presentation of the report to the steering committee, followed by a press conference. The public will be asked to adjourn, and the media is asked to remain for 2 press conferences, one with a panel, and then with the steering committee members of Bersih. Well, 25th of March 2014, It's today a culmination of many, many months of hard work and dedication and complete perseverance on the part of many volunteers. We'd like to thank the steering committee, the former steering committee, for convening the organizing committee, and of course, quite a number of our volunteers, including the legal team. So today, on the 25th of March, may I now invite the chairperson, Professor Yashpal Ghai, to present the report of the People's Tribunal on the 13th general election to the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I will give a brief summary of our report. Our report is very lengthy, and you will get copies shortly. But we have a summary from which I will read the relevant extracts. In addition to the summary and the report, there is also in your document a CD which includes all the evidence that was presented to us, as well as submissions by the lead counsel. So these three documents will probably give you all the material you need to evaluate our report. So I'm not going to explain, which we do in the report, the foundation of the tribunal and its purposes, since these are known to you. We were appointed by Bersay to investigate the conduct of the elections of 2013, and our mandate was to investigate violations of laws and international standards of free and fair elections. We were to consider whether these acts had an impact on the legitimacy of the outcome of the elections. And we were to review the electoral process which took place in 2013, and in particular identify any shortcomings in the formation, powers, functions, and operating procedures of the Electoral Commission, and that do not adhere to international standards and that prevent or impede a free and fair electoral process. And finally, we were to consider and make recommendations as we deem appropriate with regard to any findings or conclusions that we have reached. I'll say a word or two about the procedure that we followed. We are an independent commission, independent tribunal, even though we were appointed by Bersay. No pressure has ever been placed on us as to our findings, and we have scrupulously looked at the evidence, and when we had witnesses, we have sometimes cross-examined them, especially if they were not actually present at the scene that is the basis of that evidence. Our primary objective throughout has been to find out if the elections were conducted fairly and in conformity with the law and international standards, and to recommend reforms that would enhance democracy and promote national unity. We held in this room several public sessions from the 18th to the 21st September. And I should like again to thank the lead counsel, Professor Gurdial Singh Nijar, and his team for the excellent presentation they made of the law as well as of the evidence. We also want to thank the 75 witnesses who attested to different aspects of the electoral process, 49 of them in person, and others through statutory declarations. What was missing from our proceedings was any evidence or submission from the government or the election commission. This, we understand, was not for want of trying on the part of Bersey, who did invite them to participate. We hope that now that our report is ready, they will examine it and respect our credentials as an independent body and in the boundaries of constituencies, in voter registration, and in the rules which convert votes into seats. The overarching principle is that of equal treatment of all. The second principle is that electoral laws and regulations based on the democratic principles of democratic principles of elections, universal suffrage, direct, secrecy, free, just and fair, transparent and accountable, as well as the lawfulness or legal certainty. These are well known, and secrecy is an important element, as well as transparency and accountability. The third broad principle is free and fair contestation, providing a level playing field for all. The fourth is the participation of all stakeholders in the electoral process, and these include parties, civil society, etc. Fifthly, an independent and professional electoral management body for electoral governance. Sixth is electoral integrity in voting, counting, aggregating, and reporting results of elections. And finally, electoral dispute resolution conducted in just and timely manner. We have studied the laws, constitution, laws, regulations, which establish the electoral system in Malaysia, and we have discussed these instruments in our report, and because they are rather technical, I will not go through them now. What we are now going to give you is a summary of the issues and allegations raised before the tribunal, indicate our findings and the recommendations made to address the findings where there are failings that can and should be remedied. These recommendations relate to changes in the Constitution, in the law, and in the structure, appointment, procedure, and culture of the Electoral Commission, as well as to government practice and the enforcement of the law. We end with the final overall verdict, which I now want to give you. In a word, that final verdict has to be that the tribunal, having approached its task with an open mind, has found itself compelled to reach a conclusion that there were multiple failings in the way the elections were conducted, and that virtually every tenet of a free election was violated at some place and at some time. Though the elections may have been free in that everybody had a right to register and to vote, there were so many breaches of the law, disregard of procedures, that we have to conclude that the elections were not free and fair. I now give you briefly our findings and the recommendations flowing from these findings. First, we begin by some comments on the Constitution, which we found singularly lacking in any broad principles underlying free and fair elections. It has now become customary in contemporary constitutions to have a chapter devoted to elections with the emphasis on underlying principles that must govern free and fair elections. And for the most part, they reflect international standards. We found that was missing, though there is indeed a chapter on elections in the Constitution. So we recommend that consideration be given to amending the Constitution to include a right to vote in free and fair elections, set out the principles of a free and fair electoral system, especially secret ballot, and that as far as possible, the votes should all be of equal value. Provide for the principle of equal access to the media, particularly at election time. It should include clear and effective provisions to ensure the independence of the Election Commission, including in the process of appointment of its members. We think the Constitution should provide some framework principles for political parties and their regulation, and that the Constitution should provide that caretaker governments in the run-up to elections must not take initiatives or make promises designed to influence the outcome of the election. Your population will be voting. At the moment, the proportion of voters is probably less compared to the percentages in other countries. We also have some comments on the vote by Malaysians overseas, and we believe that, of course, not everyone abroad should have a right to vote. There should be some continuing connection with the country, and a lot of countries don't actually have any mechanism for vote by their diaspora. But we did notice that voters in some countries did not have the same chance as those in others to participate in the Malaysian elections. This discrimination is wrong and a violation of the rights to equality promised in the Constitution. The Tribunal also notes that even prisoners on parole are not able to vote, and is glad to know that the government is considering the position of prisoners as voters. And we therefore recommend that care should be taken to ensure that all residents overseas are treated equally, regardless of where they live, and that consideration is given to lowering the voting age to 18, as I have already mentioned. The next principle we consider is one person, one vote, one value. This principle is a key part of fair elections. The first past the post electoral system used in Malaysia depends heavily for its integrity on the constituency boundaries. Firstly, the individual voters will not be equally represented if they are in constituencies with significantly different numbers of voters. And secondly, the actual outcome of overall results can be severely affected by moving boundaries, the process known as gerrymandering. The law, in fact, even the Constitution of Malaysia is rather weak in the ways it deals with both these issues. But the way in which the rules have been applied is a greater problem. There is some rationality to allowing rural constituencies that are sparsely populated to have fewer voters in order to ensure that the MP does not have an impossibly large area to cover. But it does subordinate the equality of the vote to administrative convenience and quality of representation. There is no justification for giving more urban areas greater representation by means of making voter numbers smaller. It is against the law, which seems to have happened in a number of areas. It is hard to see how having one constituency 9 times the size of another in terms of electorate can be described as approximately equal, which is what the Constitution requires. A witness gave evidence that on average, a vote for BN was worth 1.6 times a vote for PR, because PR-leaning constituencies are on average larger. Gerrymandering is the deliberate manipulation of boundaries to achieve certain results, not just by size, but by makeup of electorate. We had ample evidence that this has happened in Malaysia. And some things that happened could not be justified even on the basis of ensuring that there is coherence in the constituency to be represented by one member. In other words, there is a certain degree of homogeneity. Instead, we found that the boundaries separated neighbors or even members of a single household into separate constituency, and this cannot be justified on any basis whatsoever. The Tribunal therefore recommends that the law be changed to clarify the criteria and the extent to which they may be diverged from to accommodate sparsely populated areas. It endorses the recommendation that the task of boundary delimitation be conducted by a body other than the Electoral Commission, such as a Boundaries Commission, which is quite common in other countries, to strengthen the integrity of the process and also to avoid overburdening the Electoral Commission. That body should also be independent and expert, conducting its work with public consultations. And its reports could either be final by its own promulgation or could be submitted to the House of Representatives. We don't have any firm recommendation on this. Last point. Consideration should also be given to providing that any changes in the boundaries reviews as to when the boundary reviews take place. At the moment, I think there can't be more than once in 8 years. And we believe that it would be necessary to fix a cycle of reviews. Most countries have a rule that after every consensus, which is normally 10 years, a review should be undertaken, because at that showing identification, it is hard to believe that there was no collusion on the part of the staff of the Electoral Commission. Again, registering 1 or 2 people in the wrong constituencies might be carelessness. Registering those who have not sought registration is suspicious. And there was a great deal of evidence requiring those who have not sought registration. Sorry, I'm confusing the 2 sentences. And there was a great deal of evidence presented to the tribunal that considerable numbers of people have been registered somewhere other than where they live. Names of those who had died were still sometimes on the registers. There was a great deal of evidence about suspicion of foreigners registering to vote. This, in our view, was somewhat speculative. people who appear to be foreign, we were told, were seen in the vicinity. And it is hard to draw any firm conclusion about and to the extent to which foreigners might have found their way on the register. But the recently concluded Royal Commission of Inquiry into illegal immigrants in Sabah was told by the Director General of Sabah, NRD, that there were about 113,000 problematic ICs in Sabah. And the tribunal was told that the EC has claimed that it cannot verify the authenticity of these identity cards. This situation offers great scope for phantom, that is, unentitled voters. The tribunal therefore recommends that the register is regularly and scrupulously checked to make sure that dead and other phantom voters are not included. For East Malaysia at least, but preferably for the entire country, the register should be compiled afresh from scratch, since such serious shortcomings have been revealed. Care must be taken to ensure that the register is clear and that it is clear that what is the final register. And this recommendation follows from the evidence that what was purported to be the final register was not the register used in a number of constituencies. We have seen in other countries too, my own country in Kenya, if I can just say, where there were different registers floating around. And so it was very hard in the end to test the accuracy of the voting, because some registers were never in the public domain. The law and regulations should be overhauled to ensure that there is adequate opportunity for the electoral roll to be inspected and corrections made. Law and practice must ensure that no one's name is removed without their being given the chance to object. And again, this recommendation follows from the fact that a number of witnesses found that when they went to vote, their name had been erased. We also have some comments on postal and advance voting. A major issue in the election was what seemed to have been excessive use of postal and advance voting for certain voters based on occupation and profession. Though this may be useful to make it possible for those genuinely unable to vote on the polling date and making the right to vote more widely available in this way, it does raise problems at various stages. Interestingly, an election judge in the United Kingdom very recently warned that postal voting, freely possible in that country, in England or Britain, is in danger of making fraud as an industrial scale possible. So there have been, in recent British elections, a large number of voters who don't exist but have voted through the post office. So clearly there is need for caution here. There is some risk that postal voters will be attributed to the wrong constituency. This should not happen, but there is some evidence that it did happen in your last elections. It may be harder to check that only those who are really entitled actually were the ones who voted. Custody of ballot papers emerged also as a major issue. Concern was expressed about ballot boxes being stored in police stations under the custody of state officers, not parties to what should be the Electoral Commission principle of impartiality. There was indeed evidence of inadequately safekeeping, and we saw videos of that. and also of party agents being unable to verify the quality of custody. Risks include ballot papers being lost, especially if they are for the wrong party or person, or of genuine advance postal ballots being substituted by others, completed by officials or others, and that there is double voting by those entitled to postal or advance voting, which I think was possible because of the gap between the postal bill, that the registrar of societies is not even-handed in treatment of government and opposition parties. The particular issue raised in evidence was that the parties of the opposition grouping were refused permission to campaign as a coalition under a single logo, while Barrison National had such permission. This is a violation of the fundamental principle of equality included in the Constitution and of standards of fair election in the notion of level playing fields. Genuine elections require that everyone contesting is free to campaign, and voters can thus make their own choice informed by the campaigns. Unfortunately, there was significant evidence that parties and candidates were not always free to campaign, that intimidation was found in some places, and this was sometimes supported by official sources. The victims were mostly opposition candidates. The evidence indicates not so much that the law restricts freedom to campaign, but parties, supporters, and even officialdom obstruct the exercise of that freedom. The worst example was the tragic murder of a party supporter after threats from a rival supporter whose mother bravely and movingly testified to this commission about her son and his murder. Freedom of speech is good, but there are good reasons for some degrees of restraint and even control during election periods. There is strong evidence that some parties seriously overstep the mark in terms of their campaign strategies. We put strategies within quotes. Behavior that cannot be just unfair, but dangerous in a potentially volatile situation. Campaigning is often on ethnic lines to foster dislike and fear of other groups. The law relating to stirring up hatred seems to be largely unenforced at the time of elections. The same can be said of restrictions on campaigning in terms of time and place, intended to ensure that voters can make their individual choices without being subject to the immediate influences of posters and campaigners. The restrictions contained in the law were flouted in some places. The Tribunal therefore recommends that registration under the Societies Act should be replaced by a system tailored to the situation with specific legislation for parties administered by the revamped Electoral Commission, to which we come in a few minutes. That would take the task away from a civil servant and give it to the independent Electoral Commission. Legislation should require parties to have constitutions providing for internal democracy within the parties. This is important for ensuring that the chance of standing for election is broadened, thus expanding the choices open to voters. And the development of policy platform by parties ought to be conducted in a way that involves party members themselves. We now come to the specific issue of campaign funding. Elections should be decided on the basis of policies and competence of parties and candidates. If lavish spending becomes the determining factor, there are various risks, not just of bribery, but of fundraising from sources that will expect payback after the elections, and of voters being swayed more by appearances than by substance. There is law in Malaysia that is supposed to limit expenditure by candidates, but it does not really require party expenditure to be declared as well. Nor does it prevent supporters from spending money lavishly. Evidence was given to the tribunal that the limits are often exceeded by relying on these loopholes in the law. And therefore, we recommend that parties should be required to be open about their finances, including major sources of funds, that consideration should be given to whether some sources of funding of parties should be prohibited, and finally, that there should be a restriction of the possible expenditure by parties as well as by candidates on elections, and requirements of disclosure. Expenditure incurred by a party tailored to the campaign of a particular candidate should be attributed to that candidate. We now turn to the role of the media. In modern society, the media are a crucial part of democracy. People depend heavily for their information about parties, candidates, and their policies on the media. And normally the mainstream media, state-owned or private, are thought to be the most reliable sources. It is a great dereliction of professional obligations not to provide that information in a reasonably balanced and honest way. The tribunal concludes from the evidence before it that Malaysian mainstream print and electronic media are clearly to own methods of public communications such as newspapers. Many countries ban political parties from owning newspapers. Codes of practice should be developed to ensure that equal access during election periods is established as an important principle. We now turn to bribery, treating, and undue influence, all of which are prohibited under your own law. The most obvious of electoral malpractice is bribery. No voter should be paid money to vote, not to vote, or vote in a particular way. Treating involves giving food, drink, or refreshment to influence a person to vote or not to vote. Undue influence, by that the law means other forms of influence such as physical violence or threat of violence, abducting a voter or preventing them from voting in some other ways, or even threatening divine benefits or divine retribution. All these are in the regulations, I think. All are criminal offenses up to 2 years imprisonment and a fine of 1,000 to 5,000 ringgits. And anyone convicted is barred from voting or standing for elections for 5 years. It's always hard to prove corruption of this sort, as we know. Nonetheless, there was very considerable and convincing evidence presented to the tribunal that bribery is a common practice, and in at least in some parts of the country. Some of that evidence was given in the form of video recordings. Notably, many of the witnesses were either Orang Asli themselves or had others shown offering bribes to various types in Orang Asli communities. It is also notable that most of the evidence was of measures intended to benefit BN candidates. And the evidence points in the direction of not only candidates, but government officers, such as chiefs in Orang Asli communities, playing a part in this debasement of the electoral process. And therefore, we recommend that this should be taken very seriously through public education and the vigorous enforcement of the law. We now next turn to skewed playing field. The concept of level playing field is crucial to fair elections. Everyone contesting or willing to contest should be treated equally, not subject to unfair handicaps or deriving unfair benefits. It is perhaps unfortunate that the metaphor is derived from sports. Elections are not a game. Governments want to own elections by showing the electorate that they have and will benefit from re-electing them. But the inducement should be the adoption of policies that benefit the people, not the use of government resources in ways that discriminate unfairly and are little different from bribes. Unfortunately, there was convincing evidence that the latter was happening. Communities were promised benefits from government if they voted in a certain way, and particularly outrageously threatened that programs and services would be taken away if they did not. The tribunal heard from eyewitnesses to such behavior. This was often in the same areas where outright bribes were also being given. This is not only unfair, but is taking advantage of the more vulnerable sections of society. The brazen use of government resources, such as buses, of which there was also clear evidence, demonstrates an inability to distinguish between what belongs to the nation and what belongs to the party. The Constitution does not refer specifically to the concept of a caretaker government. The government in the period running up to elections having to be restrained in the way it carries out policies so that they are not used or seen as bribes. Yet it is widely accepted principle, and in some countries, codes of practice guide government in this period precisely to avoid abuses. We therefore recommend that such behavior be treated seriously by the Electoral Commission and other authorities. Some of it may be a criminal offense, and others should be treated as such. The Electoral Commission should take seriously the issue and issue guidance for government. There was a suggestion that the Electoral Commission felt it was unable to do so. But this seems to be a quite unjustified example of self-restraint, indeed self-crippling. The next topic we address is the ability actually to vote and the exclusion of those not entitled to vote. It is crucial that those entitled to vote and register are able to vote, and those who register are able to vote, and those who are not entitled to vote are not able to do so. There was considerable evidence of at least sloppiness in ensuring that those who voted were perhaps even told to use it, and there was no explanation why different kinds of ink seemed to have been used in different constituencies. The tribunal recommends that procedures be put in place to ensure that the correct sort of ink is required in good time. Staff at polling stations must be properly trained and properly supervised. Indelible ink is supposed to dry in a very short time. There is no reason why it should smudge the paper. And I speak as a voter, having had the paint on my finger. And staff must realize why procedures are instituted so they do not fail to follow because they cannot see the point. After the voting, the counting now. The tribunal heard sufficient evidence to indicate that After being cast, votes were not necessarily either stored or counted with adequate care. This was particularly true of the advance and postal votings, as we have mentioned, but sometimes the votes cast on the day as well. There was also evidence of errors in adding votes, or deliberate falsification of the forms on which records are kept, or ballot papers issued, spoiled, and used, and on which records of totals from counting stations are kept and added. The tribunal therefore recommends that satisfactory arrangements should be devised for the custody of ballot boxes, especially for advance and postal voting. It seems that custody in police lockups has not, unfortunately, met reasonable standards. Procedures for the scrutiny of the forms for recording must be strictly enforced so that they are not signed off until party agents have seen that they tally. Transparency and openness. There were a number of witnesses who stated that they or their agents were unable reasonably to observe stages of the process after the actual vote. Election observers, national and international, have become established as a means of monitoring election practices, strengthening thereby public confidence in the system. A country that tries to shackle them does itself no service. There is no basis for viewing foreign observer teams as some sort of colonial conspiracy. While foreign observers contribute to an international focus on the elections, it is often the case that the local groups understand the issues better, and they will almost certainly be able to cover more ground and do so over a longer period. The evidence suggests that the government could have strengthened local observation by choosing some other groups. The groups that were involved in the elections seem to have done an admirable piece of work. The evidence suggests that Electoral Commission invited certain election observers but did not invite others. We recommend, therefore, that arrangements or observation of elections should be decided well in advance and on the basis of clear criteria. Election monitors should be free to apply to get accreditation from the Electoral Commission based on the requirements stipulated in the law. The Electoral Commission, perhaps one of the most important issues that we examined. The Electoral Commission is at the heart of any election system. Courts can handle only a small number of cases. The real first line of defense against malpractice is the Commission. Like the judiciary, the Commission must be independent and be seen to be independent. The Constitution and the law do not adequately guarantee that independence. The method of appointment does not guarantee independence, even if after appointment, I'll read that again. The method of appointment does not guarantee independence, even if after appointment members cannot be readily dismissed. The independence of the body is further undermined by the practice of filling it with current and retired public servants, all necessarily having served the particular party that forms government. That makes it hard to escape a conclusion that SPR, or the Electoral Commission Malaysia, was designed as the instrument of the ruling party to help keep it in power. In its operation, the Electoral Commission is too closely linked to government. Under the Constitution, the King, Agong, must follow what is traditionally but misleadingly termed the advice of the cabinet. unless the Constitution or a law specifies otherwise. There is no such clear specification in relation to the King's approval of regulations made by the EC on the conduct of elections, his consent to the release of certain information under the Election Commission Act, or his making of regulations changing the salaries, benefits, etc. of the Commission, though we acknowledge that the Constitution prevents these elections based not on direction and intervention from the ruling party, but on the Constitution and the law. Evidence suggests that returning officers and polling officials were able to exercise too much discretion at the operational level, voting and counting. Operational procedures for all aspects of election are not yet regulated comprehensively. The conclusion seems inescapable that radical change in the Electoral Commission is essential if faith in Malaysian elections is to be restored. And we recommend that the Electoral Commission must be independent in its method of appointment, its operation, and its mindset. To achieve this, some changes in the law are required, and the Constitution, and some changes in appointment practices, and some changes in behavior are also required. It would be necessary to develop a method of appointment of a truly independent commission. The current method is essentially the same as for senior judiciary. That method would not be considered sufficiently independent in many countries. Judicial service commissions have widely been adopted for appointing judges to ensure their independence. The law must be changed to make the EC more independent in its operations from the government. Equally important as changes in the law is a change in the culture of the Electoral Commission from one that presupposes the outcome of the elections to one that allows the people to determine that outcome. The reborn Electoral Commission must be proactive, and it must have the legal backing for that action. Consideration should be given in revising the legislation to enforcement powers. Should it have the power to prosecute rather than referring the matter to the public prosecutor, that is the Attorney General, a government agent? The reformed Electoral Commission will need capacity building so that its staff can cope effectively with new responsibilities and challenges. We turn to police and administrators, and these important elements of government system do not always seem to have fully internalized the nature of the roles they are to play in connection with elections. The evidence suggests a culture of party subservience that is at odds with the ideals of a democratic system. There are problems with the law, but most of the issues are with the vigilance of the authorities and their responsiveness. There were many reports that complaints have been made but not taken seriously by the Electoral Commission or by the police. Prosecutions under election laws have to be approved by the public prosecutor, that is the Attorney General, an officer who owes the appointment to the government and can be dismissed at will. And we recommend that prosecution of election offenses should not require the approval of an essentially political appointee. A policy of vigorous enforcement of these laws needs to be introduced. The police should be trained in what is involved. There is much experience of developing mechanisms to deal with corruption. Corruption in the areas of elections is very important and should be treated like other forms of corruption. Disputes. Over the years, the law has been changed to limit the scope of dispute resolution in election cases through the courts. It is particularly regrettable that the electoral roll can no longer be challenged after it has been gazetted. Without a detailed reading of individual cases, it's not easy to see how far judges have been excessively technical in their judgments in election petition cases. But there are enough examples which show the need to review what are essentially technicalities defeating the cause of justice. When election petitions have failed, the size of costs awarded against the losing petitioners have been large, a serious deterrent to the use of this important procedure for ensuring fairness in elections. Awards of course should not be used in a way that acts as a major deterrent to bringing election petitions. And we therefore recommend that the law should be changed to ensure that challenges can be brought to inaccurate electoral registers. And consideration should be given to ensuring that costs are not a deterrent to reasonable petitions. You will be pleased to know that I'm coming to the conclusion of my presentation. The first point is the validity of the results. Much was wrong with the GE13. Did it affect the results? The tribunal was presented with evidence from scholars that suggests that it may well have done. One had concluded that gross malapportionment of constituency had probably had this effect. And the Merdeka Center says in its report that without postal or advance votes, BN would have lost the election. It won an election, but people do not believe that it won. This has very serious implications for the country, for the government itself may lack that acceptance of the people. The whole electoral process too may come to be discredited. Why should people continue to turn out if they do not feel their vote makes any difference? Or they may turn out just to earn their bribe. Who benefits? Realistically, the tribunal was not destined to receive large number of complaints about flaws in the process caused by or benefiting PR. They lost. PN, the winners, effectively boycotted the tribunal process. Nevertheless, it is not possible for us to ignore the strength of the evidence to the effect that most of what was done was to the benefit of BN. Not everything that is done for a winning party is done by it, of course. However, as a government, as a party, or as a government, and with considerable influence over the Electoral Commission, the finger must point largely to BN, as well as to its supporters and beneficiaries. But of course, no one really benefits from elections that are not properly conducted. Systemic problems. The lead counsel suggested that the tribunal should be concerned with whether the flaws, if found, were systemic. Being systemic implies that they exist widely and over time. The tribunal would not suggest that every constituency election was contaminated by the sort of failures that were attributed to it. Certain constituencies were marginal or could be made marginal by gerrymandering. Though there might be weaknesses in other places, systemic and deliberate manipulation would occur where it can make a difference. But such targeted fraud, that is what it is rightly termed systemic. The system can and will do it where it is worthwhile. Nothing, it seems, that happened in the last elections had not happened before. except where indelible ink was concerned, overseas voters, and changes in the advance voting rules, where new opportunities have been created. There is a considerable body of literature about Malaysian elections and how the system has indeed been subverted. Electoral system. These are our own reflections. Malaysia uses a system of voting and translating votes into seats, often called first past the post. That is common, and that often generates the sort of disproportion between votes and seats as seen in your own last elections. To avoid this, it requires strict adherence to one person, one vote, one value principle. It makes boundary drawing of crucial importance. A decision was made to adopt this system at the time of independence. It's unlikely that there will be much support for a total change of system. People are used to one system and often reluctant to change. But the tribunal does briefly raise the issue of considering another system, one that ensures that votes for a party translate into seats. There were several different systems that ensured this. It's also possible to change in a different way to a system that ensures that no one can win a seat when the majority of voters are positively against that person. This involves either a runoff second election if no one wins half the votes, or a preferential voting system under which people rank their choices among candidates. If no one gets 50% plus one, the lowest candidate is eliminated and his or her votes are redistributed. I won't go into the technicalities. All we are suggesting is that you might put on the agenda the consideration of alternative methods of converting votes into seats, either through proportional system or preferential system, so that you don't have the kind of situation as you have had last time, where one party gets a reasonable or clear majority of the votes, but number of seats do not reflect that, and in fact they are not able to form a government, though the vote suggests that majority of the people would prefer it to form a government. We know that changes are hard, electoral changes are hard. You require time to decide on the change. You require a longer time perhaps to make people aware of the new system. But we think this is something perhaps if the government doesn't respond, that Burse could set up some working group to look at alternative voting systems. Well, the final verdict. The electoral system is important, it's hard to change, and needs much consideration. And the evidence suggests that it is actually not the real reason why the elections in 2013 have been so discredited. About the real reasons for discrediting, something can be done. Though weakened in some respects, the framework for an election process with integrity is there already in your laws. It needs to be implemented fully and are designed to achieve. It fails the people of Malaysia. The inescapable conclusion must be that the elections of 2013 fell short in every one of these 7 parameters for democratic election that we started with. Thank you for your patience.
We are now distributing the summary that Professor just read out. Thank you, eminent members of the tribunal. Thank you very much, not only for your deliberations and your findings, but also the specific recommendations. Before we open the floor for a Q&A, I'd like to also acknowledge the presence of human rights commissioners in our midst, members of parliament, ex and present, I see witnesses too, many witnesses, members of the Bar Council, NGOs, and members of the public for making the time to come here, and also embassy officials. Thank you very much for making the time to be with us. Right. I would like to also inform you before we start the Q&A, there is live streaming going on, which means you're being videoed. It'll be available on YouTube for you to watch the proceedings. Okay. Right. Are we ready? Please feel free to raise a question. Just go to the mic, give us your name, and then pose the question or comment. The floor is now open. We'll give you a little bit of time to go through sift through the summary. Has everybody got a...
The summary.
Please raise your hands if you need you should have by now the report and the summary. Yeah. Sorry, what is it? Where? I don't see anyone. Can you please just walk up to the mic? Somebody's raised their hand?
I think with the audience, then with the press later.
They're looking for the paper. Could I also have the summary, please?
Could we also have the summary? Yes, sir.
Any comments, any questions? Yes, Dr. Zul.
We have it for, then...
Lady Chair,
I passed mine.
honorable members of the panel, fellow Malaysians and distinguished audience. Assalamu alaikum and salam sejahtera. I would be brief since I do not see anybody standing up. I'll just brave myself to do it first.
Yes, please. Introduce yourself, though.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm Zulkifli Ahmad, a former member of Parliament from the constituency of Kuala Selangor. I testified, as you might recall. I'm not here to, again, run down the government, please. I think they have run down themselves enough. And I wouldn't be pretentious to believe that we have a vibrant and a functional democracy. But let me be honest to say this very quickly, that for a vibrant democracy, we need to have an intense and extensive contestation. And in your finding, distinguished panels, honorable panels, I think it's a far cry from it. Now, perhaps the People's Tribunal has been now more an academic exercise, and although it must be, we must thank you, in all earnestness and sincerity, that you have done a great job, and I think the audience wouldn't mind to put their hands together for a big applause for our honorable panels. Now, what would be, my question, what would be the way forward? Having collated all this final verdict, what would be a advocacy for a free and fair election, particularly to Bersih, and I stand here perhaps as in a bipartisan way, would be a concrete way forward for reforms, for a not just free but more importantly fair election, for it to ever be realized in a country like ours, where everyone seems to have to be comfortable enough to say that yes, we have a free and fair election, but going by the details, it is a far it's far from it. So we would like to hear concretely, particularly over reforms and media access particularly. I think I will just limit myself to that question. I thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask, in the first instance, Malaysian members of the panel to answer this question. And I'm going to start with Mavis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do feel that I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are, that I do feel that at this stage we have much more people involved and people concerned about the electoral process and how it has affected or damaged the kind of democracy that we want. I would like to see this report receive a much wider audience, perhaps through debates, because many of the
election process. We have made, the tribunal now has made some recommendations to correct those failings, those failures. It's not going to be an easy thing to get the powers that be to adopt some of those recommendations. Indeed, some of the recommendations may not even find acceptance with you or some of the political parties. But I believe that this, if we are interested in to ensure a free and fair elections, we can use this, you can use this as a basis, which is to identify those failures and failings and correct those processes, procedures that we have been highlighted here, that have been brought out in evidence. And I believe it requires not just you, the civil society, it requires every individual. It requires the political parties, it requires the parliamentarians to be alive and be vigilant about this. If you recall, for example, you cannot challenge in the electoral register if once it has been gazetted. How often does the political party or you yourself check when they come out with the register, and to ensure that you are there or somebody that you know have died may have remained on the register? They say that liberty, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And I believe eternal vigilance is required from all of us to ensure that once you have changed the laws or you have amended the laws, you have introduced the procedures, you have the people who will abide by those laws, people who enforce those laws, and people with the sense that all those laws have to be interpreted in the spirit that they have been formulated, and that is to ensure a free and fair election. So all of us have to, all of us, people, parties, have to be involved in carrying this forward. We may be able to do it for the next election. We may not be able to do it, but there will be repetition. There may be repetition, but it requires then enforcement. So this is only maybe a beginning. There have been a number of other reports, as you know, and maybe it will be left on the shelf. But if you are all interested in it, then we have to take it up and move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Any other questions? Yes, Rama.
My name is Ramanathan. I'm a concerned citizen. Thank you for the work of the tribunal and the presentation today. I have 3 questions. I couldn't help noticing that the presentation was very much influenced, and obviously because the ruling party was not present. But I would like to raise these questions. In your opinion, what do you think the EC did well? I mean, are there any things that they did well? I mean, the second question I have, and perhaps you're not able to answer this, but I'll ask it anyway. On a scale of countries, rankings, and maybe I'll put North Korea at the bottom. I don't know what I'd put at the top. Where would you say that we are? Probably about 200 countries in the world. I don't know how many are democracies, or at least, or even pseudo-democracies. But where would you say we are? Are we about midpoint, or are we at the bottom of the heap? The third question that I have is, of all the submissions, I understand that you listened to submissions for 5 days. What did you find not credible? I mean, did you find everything that was said credible, or were there some things that you found not credible? Thank you.
Thank you, Rama.
Well, as you rightly started your presentation, your question with, we did not have evidence from the government or from the election committee. There may be achievements have remained unsung as a result. We did read some of these assessments by observers, and at a superficial level, it seemed the system was working. There was a register, there were polling stations, there were ballot papers, there was even ink. So I think one report says outwardly it seemed the system is working, so I think one needed to explore, go below the surface to see what really went wrong. Had some sort of register. I mean, there is an outward appearance of competence, regulations, rules are published. But again, this is an area where I'm sure my Malaysian colleagues are better placed to say. Clearly, the work of the Commission was to look at violations of the rules and of the principles, international standards and so on. Our job wasn't to investigate what went very well. We focused on what went wrong. So certainly the evidence we got was not directed towards how well it was. And this is why we regret very much, and we say this in our report, that we didn't really have the participation of either the government or the Electoral Commission that might have produced a slightly different picture. But in the end, by looking at all the evidence we had, we were convinced that there were gross violations. And so the election couldn't be said to be truly free and fair. Now, do any of you want to say something?
To the first question around the EC.
On your first point, whether, in our opinion, that was there anything that the EC did well? Well, the EC has actually had a whole number of elections that it has run over the years. In the past, when the opposition was weak and there was, in a way, no real competition, I don't say that the electoral process was fair, but whatever it was, the feeling was the BN would win anyway. So there wasn't that much concern about the integrity of the electoral process. Things have changed now, and competition is very, very tight. The last election showed that there were a number of constituencies which could have gone either way. And in some cases, it was the advance and postal voters that made the difference. So now we are in a different situation, and we are much more concerned about the fairness of the elections because it would have an impact on who wins. And therefore, it is for this reason that we have been primarily directing our efforts in trying to pinpoint weaknesses in the system, weak flaws, which may have existed before, but which are now more important because it can determine who wins and who loses. On a scale of ranking, I'm afraid I don't have enough information to be able to tell you, where we stand. I don't think it matters, frankly. I think we want our democracy to be a functional, well-functioned and well-developed democracy. We don't really care about what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think we should be concerned about the fact that we have in a superficial way a democracy, but elections, which is the core of any democracy, is not working so well. So I really cannot say that we've come into in the middle or at the bottom of the ranking. Not credible. I think that it was difficult for us to decide the credibility of the witnesses themselves. We did cross-examine them, but of course what we were primarily concerned about was that there were specific cases, and we were not sure whether this particular problem was widespread or not. Sometimes they were just telling us of a particular incident that happened in their constituency. And we were concerned about trying to find out whether this was a widespread kind of a flaw or a problem, or whether this was just specific to that particular constituency at that particular time. And this was something we deliberated upon. And I guess we had to come to some opinion. And that's what we have written in our report. Thank you.
Right. There's a second question around the ranking. How do we rank?
Unfortunately, you didn't put in our terms of reference.
Okay, so that's a good response. We are not in the... How do we rank? We're not a football team. Okay, the last question was around... Are you all done with the questions? Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you. I'm Khalid Abdul Samad. I'm Member of Parliament for Shah Alam. With the opposition from the Islamic Party, and I skipped Parliament in order to attend your program.
Thank you.
So first, I'd like to thank the Tribunal for having given a very thorough report. And I think I'd like to comment on the question as well when asking what did the EC do right. It allowed the candidates to contest. So that it did right. I mean, it could have just disqualified all the candidates that he wanted, and ensure his victory. But obviously, there was a very, how do you say, it's relatively free, but definitely not fair. Right? The elections were relatively free. I mean, the opposition party could have its leaflets, could have its programs, could have its public speeches, and so on and so forth. We could register, we could move. I mean, but there were areas that were just enough to make it more advantageous for the ruling coalition, right? I mean, obviously the electoral roll is a very major element of a democratic process. Just for the information for the tribunal, Dato' Azad mentioned about the question of eternally vigilant. I believe that we have been vigilant every time the electoral roll is being put on display. At the same time, maybe this did not come up in your investigation. The Selangor state government went through all the new names that were in the electoral list since 2008. We compared the list in 2008 and 2013. There were 500,000 new voters, rounding up. Yeah? Out of the 500,000, 137,000 could not be found, either by the village heads, by the local councillors, and so on and so forth. We couldn't find them. And we give this list of 137,000 names to the Electoral Commission, and They lectured us and told us this is not the role of the state government, right? This is not what the state government is supposed to do. And they took the list and they put it aside. In the parliament, there was a special parliamentarians select committee that was formed, going through the electoral process, and that special select committee, we were represented in the select committee, and we identified 42,000 names in the electoral list, which the Department of Registration mentioned officially that these names, they were all, each name was given an identity card number. The identity card numbers for these names did not come from their department. It was not issued by the Department of Registration, right? And even then, the EC representative who was in this special select committee refused to take out the 42,000 names, saying in Parliament that they do not have the authority to take out the names. So it's not a question of enforcement. Yeah? My point that I want to come to is, it's a question of not having the right philosophy and commitment to the democratic process. Yeah? They don't believe that the rakyat and the majority of the rakyat have the right to form government. They believe and they indoctrinate the government officials that only the ruling coalition can rule. And for the sake of the nation, that must be maintained. Right? So everything is being done outwardly to show, a democracy, but the whole philosophy behind the government, and unfortunately, the government departments and all the commissions that's been formed, the whole philosophy is how to keep the ruling coalition in power. So you have, just slight amendments here, slight adjustments there, but in the final analysis, Barisan Nasional must have more than 112 parliamentary seats. I like to mention also that somebody did a study and said that to get 112 seats, you only need 25% of the votes, of the popular votes. If in each and every 112 seats, you win by one vote, you only need 25% of the votes, right? So when the government is not involved, the question, I just like to know. I'm so used to giving speeches, and it's a problem with politicians.
Missing parliament.
Yes, right. Thank you for the signal. Without the involvement of the government, they're not interested in democracy. Right? How can we bring about the kind of changes that we're talking about? I mean, to be very frank, we can present all our arguments, we bring all the facts, we show the international standards and all that sort of thing. But in the final analysis, if the government and the government officials themselves are not interested in the principles of democracy, and that the majority has the right to form the government, I mean,
thank you, IB.
What can we do? Yeah? So I'd like to ask the tribunal on that point.
There's a question there.
That's the question. Somewhere in there, there's a question.
Right. We have time for one last question, but would you like to respond to YB?
I thank the Member of Parliament very much for pointing out that we heard that if you were challenged, you will have to pay $10.
Yeah.
But we didn't hear that if you, of course, you fail, what would be the price? I suppose there's always, apart from vigilance, there's always money involved in all these things. But as you pointed out, maybe that's what you've got to do. Because if you say in Kelantan you spend a lot of money to make sure that the electoral rolls are clean, and we didn't hear of any problems in Kelantan, and we know who wins in Kelantan. I don't know that, whether there could be a suggestion that they have kept the rolls specially for themselves. But that's a price to pay. And it would appear that in Kelantan, the government is prepared to do that. Well, you ask whether the federal government is prepared to do that, and they can't do that. They say they won't do that. But if you, as a member of parliament, speaking in parliament, cannot do this, cannot say, look, there is this problem, we've got to change the law, or we're going to, it's not about who rules, but whether the people's choice will be truly reflected in the result.
Thank you. I see two people standing up, so the first person go. Thank you.
Good morning to the panel and also all those present here today. My name is JJ Dennis. I'll try to be very brief. I would like to elaborate on the point by Dato' Azad and YB Khalid Samad earlier on challenging the legitimacy of the electoral roll. Because the Elections Act, there is a special provision under 9A which disallows any challenge to the electoral roll after it's been gazetted by the EC. And to my knowledge, even two members of parliament have gone to court to challenge it, but then the judges have said, look, here is 9A and you can't challenge. Because you have missed the cut, you can only challenge the roll after it's been gazetted within 30 days. So it seems to me like the Election Commission is a supranational body above even the federal constitution. So based on your experience, is there any way we can work around it? Because the only way to amend the law is for amendment to be tabled in Parliament. And if you do not have the numbers there, then it can't be done.
Right. Good
so
question.
Based on your experience, is there a way we could work around this, or we are left with the brick wall here?
Thank you, Dennis.
Well, you can try and work within the 30 days. That's why I said the political parties themselves must be vigilant and look through. The moment it comes out, they probably have to have a special section. Civil society too could have it. Because the problem now is you're only looking at it come the elections. You know the law. If you feel that 30 days is too short, change the law and say, look, this is not right. 60 days, 90 days, or able to change it at any time. Yes, we know that there was an amendment, and you know why the amendment was put in. Because there was a challenge to the electoral, well, the register in the one election in Sabah. And because the judge there found it been proved that there were illegal or non-citizens registered, voided the whole elections. And since then, that is the law. You cannot challenge it outside the 30-day period. This is why we say, look, you look at the laws, whether it works for you or it works for everybody. Was it fair? If it's not, then change it. And that's where the work of the parliamentarians come in.
Okay, last question, please. Yes, are there any more hands here? Oh, please come forward, yeah. No, let's encourage.
I'm Halim Said, a concerned citizen. I know that you have not been given any mandate to make any declaration, but if you are to be given a mandate to make declaration, will the tribunal make a declaration that the 13th general election is null and void? That's the first question. The second question is that whether re-election must be held according to international standards. Thank you.
What's your second question?
I think you say...
Okay.
I believe, well, unlike Thailand, unlike Indonesia, we do not have a constitutional court where parties can challenge the whole election. And I believe, for example, in Thailand recently, they challenged the recent elections because the other party boycotted it, and the Constitutional Court declared it as a void election. We are not here to do that. We are just here to find out how the 13th general election was conducted and whether it was free and fair. And I think our findings are in the report.
Okay. Yes, very quickly.
If the tribunal is given a mandate to make declaration.
If, well, they were not.
Well, we don't deal with theoretical questions.
I know the answer is going to be, they were not mandated to do it.
Yes.
Okay, right. Yes, please. Will this be the any other? Yes, please go ahead.
I'm Mr. Tosinwa. I was the independent candidate for Kalanajaya. I'm here because, based on the findings of the panel, since it's adverse on the GE13 results, I suggest that it could be included that since nothing is more certain than to subject the whole ballot papers to maybe an institution or an independent body where they can actually study by having all the ballot papers being studied in detail, then actually the real findings and the real truth can be used for further enhancement of the election process. And that, I think, if we are all concerned citizens and we are interested in it, I think nothing is more certain than to bring forward all the ballot papers and have an independent body, maybe a university or any of this body where they can study through the papers and actually have the actual results being examined. And that, when you compare to the findings, then I think better recommendations and better ways of implementing the future elections. And also, since was the independent, I don't mind relating that actually, how could we say that the election was, it was free but unfair? How could we say that it is fair when, as an independent, we stood for election, we were not even allowed to use the symbol that we wanted, and we were only given to choose among all the historical symbols of payong, bicycle, keychains, and all. And with that sort of symbols, and we can only use that after it is being determined by the nomination, I mean the officers that we can start using that, and that's where we start our process of preparing our materials. So we are actually handicapped by both the opposition as well as the...
Madam Chairman, first I'd like to congratulate the panel for the expertise, for your work, for your commitment to the cause of free and fair elections. It couldn't have been easy, the evidence that you heard. I mean, we all heard the evidence. And you've given us a report which is not just a critical analysis of the evidence. You have given us really useful recommendations, and we thank you for that. But I think it's important for people to also recall why Bersih set up or asked for the setting up of a People's Tribunal. And it is because our complaints went unheard. And that really is the reality. The reality is that you can ask the Election Commission, you can lodge these complaints with the Election Commission, you can say it to the government, they will ignore you. And that's what happened to us. We were ignored. And that's why we felt compelled to set up a People's Tribunal. We had our own views, but we were involved. We were too involved, and we wanted an independent body to hear this. And I think we couldn't have got a better panel, frankly, and I think another round of applause is deserving.
Thank you.
And I thank you for all that you have done for Malaysia. On the second point on what J.J. Dennis raised, I just want to quickly say, I think it's time we challenge the constitutionality of 9A, which says the electoral roll cannot be examined by the court. And Bersih has asked me to look into the possibility, because right now what's happening is they are proceeding with redelineation. The EC carries on, by the way, they don't listen to, I suspect they will look at these findings and put it aside. I hope I'm wrong. But they are proceeding with the redelineation process based on the present system and based on the GE13 electoral roll. Going by our findings, actually, in relation to the electoral roll, in relation to the fact that we have to do something about the electoral roll, Bersih has asked me and some other lawyers to look into the possibility of stopping the redelineation process until they clean up the electoral roll. And I think that's critical. Otherwise, the 14 GE is going to be exactly the same. The results, I mean, you know, or they're going to even entrench their positions even further. Now, why would an EC, a responsible election commission, not even hear us when we say, all we're saying is, please clean up the roll and then do the exercise? So what does that tell you about the EC? An EC who refuses to listen to a reasonable request that the electoral roll be cleaned up before that exercise happens. So if they don't listen, we are considering going to court to try and stop the redelineation process. We may not succeed, but these are the ways in which we have to raise awareness. And I think Azad is absolutely right that, in fact, it is up to us. Because they're not listening, it just means our voices have to grow louder. And with this report, I think you've helped us make our voices louder. Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. Okay, I know I've been saying last comment, but there are two more people. Can you please come up, and then we'll have the Professor Gurdial can have the last word. And that, I mean, really, final.
My name is Lionel. I am also a very concerned citizen. And our elections, not just the last two elections, but even the elections in the past, especially, I say especially during the Mahathir era, 22 years of Mahathir era, has always been controversial. The outcome has always been controversial, and they always secured 2/3 majority to amend the constitution the way they found it suitable to them. So because of that, I also noticed that they made so many comments, and of course, I must give a great thanks to the panel who have done a great job, and also a great thanks to Brese Chairman, Ambiga, who has actually brought all this to happen, you know, all these things to happen. But at the same time, I'm thinking of something which is which we had practiced in the past, and I think some governments elsewhere have been practicing too. That is, countries like India and Sri Lanka, I think, are practicing something like this. It's something to do with the election commission. What it should do just before an election, it should be made to give out a card to every voter, so that the voter can come to the election to produce the card and say, yes, I'm a valid voter, and then cast his vote. The Election Commission has been doing this, I believe, in the early days of election during Tunku Abdul Rahman. The Election Commission had given a card to everybody who is entitled to vote. And that person comes to vote with that card. Now that practice has been done away in this country, saying that because of the internet and so on. But I think this should go on so that that will help in the credibility of the entire election process.
Thank you.
I'd like to see the comments of the panel, please. Thank you.
Right, thank you. A very quick response. Any response? No. Right. Yes.
I do agree that the client, the EC's client, is the voting public, not political parties or anyone else. And I think that the EC needs to develop a direct relationship with the voting public and do keep them informed of any changes, even in terms of constituency changes, where they're voting, where their polling station is, and where they go to vote. Why it's not done is puzzle to.
In the evidence that we gave, Pamantau report, for example, ranged across the entire country and almost every constituency. And then we highlighted the more specific cases that showed some of the features that could bear upon whether the election was free and fair. So actually, it was an extremely wide-ranging way in which we sought to present the evidence to suggest that it was not selective or one-off kind of complaints that we were talking about. And we saw also how, for example, we grilled, if I can call it that, members of parliament like Nurul Izzah and Tien Chua and all, to suggest that some of the postures that they were taking, for example, also needed to be commented upon and investigated. Some of the features, some of the little aspects that we talked about. Now, as far as the rules are concerned, the rules that we devised for this panel to hear, we were extremely very careful, and we adopted international standards. We also adopted standards that talked about absent persons who might be adversely affected. And in that regard, we had the International Criminal Tribunal rules that we followed, as well as the rules of very specific commissions, like the Goldman Inquiry into the Sabra Shatila massacres and so on and so forth. And what it meant was that we were very careful in making sure that the evidence that we presented could be challenged by those who may be affected adversely or otherwise. And we were at pains to send out letters to this effect to parties that we thought, whose conduct we thought might come under scrutiny through witnesses. And this included the police, this included the EC, this included the ruling party itself, and we invited them. We literally pleaded with them to say that we wanted all sides of the story to be narrated, because this is an extremely important thing. And they chose not to attend. And when people choose not to attend, there's very little that we can do to compel them. A Royal Commission of Inquiry, we can compel. But this is a People's Tribunal, we cannot compel. But at the same time, what we then did was also try to present the other side to the extent that we could. And that is why, for example, we highlighted the petitions of the Barisan Nasional candidates as well, and tried to give it as equal an emphasis as we could muster within our ability. It was also suggested that the EC, did they do anything right? I think the report speaks for itself, because the report does talk about the fact that EC functioned generally well during the period between the dissolution of Parliament and polling day. And this is I'm reading from the report which you quoted from an accredited observer of the process itself, accredited by the Election Commission. And they made it very clear most procedures and operations were conducted smoothly, and there were no major glitches. So that's the answer to whether you said anything right about the EC or not. But at the same time, then you subjected the actual practice and the application of the rules and procedures, and the fact that the EC is supposed to know what to do, and measured it against what was actually done in law and in practice, and then made an overall conclusion that the wrong party may have been declared to be the winner of the 2013 elections. So there seems to be a very carefully, even-handed approach that the panel in its report has set out rather clearly. One or two very small points I want to raise. And the other point that was made by the chairman in response is, you see, what we're dealing here is a disquiet that pervaded after the elections, and that is what prompted the People's Tribunal. And hence, we're not actually looking to praise Caesar, as it were, but we were looking at all the facets of the disquiet to ascertain whether these were just grumblings of discontented, losing candidates, losing parties, whether there was any credibility. And this is what the task was, to see what this whole disquiet was about and whether there was any validity in this. And I think the answer has been quite resounding and clear. Now, the other point that I want to raise is about the Section 9A of the and the judiciary and so on. Now, essentially, in our submissions, and it is also quoted, I'm glad to see in the report, there is a lot of scope for 9A. 9A has its parallel in the Indian Elections Act. And there it has been decided differently. They have overcome 9A because judiciary then plays a very crucial role. So it's also the attitude of the judiciary that is very important. We can go to courts, but if you're going to be rebuffed, then it becomes very difficult. And to update the proceedings, So many petitions were dismissed on the ground of technicalities. And your report also notes that subsequent to that, 4 of them, you can appeal to the federal court. 4 of the cases, appeals were allowed. Technicalities were overruled. In one specific case that I know of, the case involving the part where one of the supporters was murdered, the federal court said that remitted it back to the election court on the ground that the fact that the lawyer was not allowed to represent was a technical flaw that should not have been decided upon by the court in the way they did. Send it back to the High Court. Some other preliminary objections were raised, and those preliminary objections.
Fellow panelists want to thank Berse very much for the honor it did us by asking us to sit on this body. It's been, for me, an extremely interesting and rewarding experience. And we hope very much that our report will be of some value. We have, as Professor Gurdea said, tried to be very objective and identified the defects of the system. And I hope very much, as coming from a country where the only way we actually got to reforming our electoral system was after a massacre, after displacement of 1 million people from their home and ethnic conflict. I talked about this in the last session in September. There was such violence in society, mutilation of people, unbearable. So we got a number of eminent Africans led by Kofi Annan to help us to see the way forward. And one of the measures was that we set up a commission to look at the electoral system. A former judge of the South African Constitutional Court and a former chair of the South African Electoral Commission was appointed the chair of that commission, along with the New Zealand expert on elections and a Norwegian or Danish who was secretary of that body, along with some eminent Kenyans, and they charted the course for us, which was adopted. We now have a pretty good legal electoral system, but we still have problems of manipulation, of rigging. So this is, as people have said, and we have noted, it's a matter of political culture. You can reform the law, but the practice may not conform to it. But I hope very much that you can make these reforms without the trauma that we had to go before we address the issues. So I thank you all again. I also want to thank Professor Gurdea, who's done a wonderful job. And the point he makes is good. We always felt when you were speaking that you had weighed the probabilities as you described today. And we felt, for the most part, we could rely on it, and you not only made claims of particular kinds, but you provided us with enormous documentation, both from the witnesses, but also from the background analysis, scholarly work. And we were very fortunate to have all that material before we started our deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right. We have a little bit of a ceremony now. We would like to invite Professor Yashpal to come down here, where you will officially hand over the report to the Berse chairperson and her team. So why don't you go over there? Can I invite the Berse 2.0 steering committee to go and get the report first, to get the report. Can the members of the SC also please join, line up behind? Thank you. Can I invite now Maria to give us a few words? Very few.
Salam sejahtera and very good morning to everyone. I just want to say that, the People's Tribunal on Malaysia's 13 general elections is really the culmination of a great amount of work of the civil society. And that is because we are really committed to uphold the whole process of the democratic system by holding the authorities accountable. And there is really a long list of thank you due to all of them from all of us at Bersih 2.0. First of all, I really want to thank the organizing committee, Gerald, Irene, although Irene now is in hospital with acute heart attack. Our prayers go for her. Ivy, Mira, for their hard work in planning and overseeing and ensuring the smooth running of this whole People's Tribunal. And also to her team, Sally, and everyone else. And I want to also say that we are very grateful to the legal team, almost 40 over lawyers who is led by Professor Goodell, Robin, who has actually systematically scrutinized all the documents. And it's in boxes, before presenting them as evidences. Thank you very much. And they really deserve a great clap to a democratic nation. Like all other efforts, it has not been easy. But the relevance of a People's Tribunal has been always questioned right from day one by our cynics. And it is also very unfortunate that a key stakeholder, which is the Election Commission, has actually refused to actually participate in this tribunal. And they have actually unfairly dismissed this whole tribunal as a means for Bersih to pass judgment on the government. They have actually missed the point. The fact is that the Election Commission refusing to engage with the people goes to show their sheer arrogance of that institution, who we must not forget, and neither should they, that their duty is to serve the people and not political parties. These critics forget that in a country that professes to be democratic, but has so few platforms for free speech, where many in authority remain deaf and dumb to the people's wishes, as manifested in Bersih 2.0's demand. Alternative channels for the people to voice their grievances are not only legitimate, but all the more powerful for having the force of the people behind them. The present platforms for the people to ventilate their grievances and seek reliefs, a good example would be the judiciary. But look what has happened to our judiciary. They have actually proven to be incapable or unwilling to do what they are constitutionally bound to do. As such, the People's Tribunal will do that, and we hope that it will also address the people's grievances for the wrong committed in GE13. Their verdict, the People's Tribunal's verdict, speaks the truth, and that is what the people want to hear. The elections are not free and fair. It is tainted, in their words, with multiple failings and had violated all principles of clean and fair elections. What we are clear is that we do not want elections to be stolen again. We do not want our votes to be devalued. And we do not want our elections to be predetermined even before the elections even started, through malapportionment and gerrymandering, and promises of payback. No more. It is not just about leveling playing field, but actually free and fair election is about justice. And free and fair election is about building democratic governance. That is the truth. Barisan Nasional has over the past 50 years been in control of the elections results. But this time, no more. And for any other elections, no more. They have to listen to the will of the people. And we must not forget that the real authority is you, the people. And in all historic rallies of Bersih 2.0 and the Pemantau election monitoring project for GE13, all of which were civil society endeavors, this People's Tribunal is another manifestation of the same people power. We saw this rising of people power in GE13 itself, which recorded a voter turnout of 83%, the highest ever in our election, and in the number of people involved in GE13 as polling and counting agents and also observers. This is an undeniable trend in our history, whereby citizens are coming forward to claim our right to participate in the democratic processes. It is also about instituting reform in governance, and the People's Tribunal is another proud milestone for Malaysians. We will, of course, present the People's Tribunal to everyone, including the Prime Minister, the relevant ministries, all MPs, the Election Commission, all relevant institutions for them to review and implement the recommendations as put forward by the 5 esteemed judges. We will definitely do that. But let us remind them as well that if they ever step out of line, if they ever, break the promises towards a clean and fair election, we, the people, will use every means to challenge all violations. And that is a promise. Thank you. Salam Bersih.
Right. Maria, your work is not over. Can I invite the panel members, starting with Professor, to come down again to receive a gift, a token of appreciation? Yeah, Maria, handing it over. Professor? Professor Yashpal first, followed by everyone, yeah. All can come down. Professor Ramlan Surbakti, Dr. Azad, Dr. Mavis, and Reverend Herman. Can you please come down and receive our humble token of appreciation? It's the only thing we can give you.